In this episode, Poppy and I talk about fake news and misinformation. In the first segment, we explain the differences between the two terms with different categories of fake news and misinformation, and then how to recognize fake news and evaluate sources. In the second part, we then discuss whether we can trust the fact checkers, whether we should censor misinformation, how these discussions affect us today, and more. So the topic of this episode is fake news and misinformation. I think logically the first thing to discuss is what exactly the difference is between fake news and misinformation. So I'll follow this one definition made by Europool, but what they say is that fake news is completely fabricated, where there's no truth, whereas misinformation can be unintentional, and I would suppose it is more common if you're living in a place where you have free access to the internet and to media. There's this project called First Draft. The aim of it is to fight misinformation and disinformation online. Ironically, it includes Facebook and Twitter, who have made controversial choices with how they regulate their content, and includes other companies besides them. But clearly these corporations are taking measures to ensure that they can stop the spread of disinformation and misinformation, especially after being pressured by U.S. Congress earlier this year into updating how they monitor that. And so I'm going to follow their definitions here and how they explain misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So misinformation is unintentional mistakes, which includes inaccurate photos, captions, dates, statistics, translations, or satire if it's taken seriously. Disinformation is fabricated or deliberately manipulated audio or written content. Conspiracy theories that are rumors that are intentionally created are disinformation, and similar things. Malinformation is the deliberate publication of private information, and this may be for personal, corporate, or political profit or benefit, and that includes doxing, sharing sensitive information, and so on, and deliberate change of context, a certain date or time of genuine content or information. So fake news is something created by an individual to profit, as explained again by Europool, or it can also be something that is state-sponsored or sponsored by state actors used for political interests, or for other people looking to discredit information or distract the audience. Sometimes it's a lot easier to see this if you study history and you look at propaganda. Even now in the world, if you look at things from North Korea or from China, it's a little more obvious what's going on. But misinformation obviously is more difficult to recognize, as it can look like any other source. Sometimes complete certainty when reading any factual article is unobtainable. So I'm looking at this article from the University of Michigan Library. So they talk about 7 types of fake news or misinformation, and then I've thought of an 8th category. So the first is satire, which is any type of media created for the sake of comedy or irony. It's not meant to be taken seriously, but they still have political biases and create a similar message or connection as would real political news. Some examples of popular satire sites are like The Onion and Babylon Bee, which we'll talk about later. So the second kind is false connection. This is not necessarily something created for malignant intent. This can be when the headlines or visuals do not relate to the content, and this is often seen with pictures.
We see that a lot in clickbait and thumbnails on YouTube.
Exactly. So the point is to gather more attention. It's not necessarily to really deceive you into changing something drastically about the way you think, but it is, as you said, just to encourage you to click on the article. The next is information that is misleading. This would be based on non-established or reliable information, or it could be meant to frame someone or deceive or persuade the reader. The next is false content, which is information without context or disproven information, which can go under the previous thing that we talked about, malinformation. But sometimes you see things taken out of context accidentally, or when things are just poorly explained. Then next we have imposter content. And this is when a site impersonates or tries to affiliate itself with a genuine source. And then next there's manipulated content. That's when facts are twisted to deceive, or pictures or statistics and information that are otherwise misleading. I think you see this especially with statistics.
For example,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, for example, the statistic on the pay gap that we talked about in the feminism episode.
And another more recent example, I think it's not always just something where binary, right? Rather it's this or that, but more so it's just by, well, how was the statistic collected? If you look at COVID cases all across the world, politicians have manipulated them, or media has tried to manipulate them to either make the cases seem less than they are or more than they are. And that includes how you want to go about recording the cases, like per million, or if you're counting cases or deaths by number of cases. But it doesn't always consider things such as there's the unreported cases, right? That was the case early on when you had hospitalizations. The death rate was higher because the sample was only from people that were hospitalized. And so that's, again, an example of unintentional misinformation. Again, I think statistics are something to be especially cautious with. And then this one that I've added after to this TED Talk by Sinan Noral, and it makes for just an appropriate additional category that I would say lost meaning. Similar to how the game Telephone or Whisper works. Are you familiar with that? It's a game where you'll stand in a line or something and you whisper something to the next person and they whisper it to the next person, and it's entertaining because the message gets distorted. And I think likewise it's valid to say that this happens in media as well, when information is handed off between multiple sources. If you have an interview and then another article that publishes that, and another form of media that then talks about that, that's why it's always good if it's no matter what the source is, to see if you can find the original thing that they're citing, if whether it's a statistic or a study or an interview. Just because maybe there's some misinformation there, things aren't explained exactly in the same way as the original source. And so that's what I mean by lost meaning. Basically, information is cycled or repeated, and things get skewed and deviate from the source's original meaning. And so next we're going to talk about how we can recognize misinformation. So there's this study that was done by the Proceedings of National Academics of Sciences, and there's an article written about this on Snopes. I'll put the link in the description. And what they found was that people who think that they can recognize fake news or misinformation, which was 90% of respondents, actually overestimated their capability. It says at least 75 overestimated their ability to tell the difference between false news headlines. And so that's a bit concerning. Obviously, if you overestimate your ability to recognize this sort of misinformation, and then you just think that it's something very easy to do, and then tune out and not use critical thinking. Would you say that you're good at recognizing this, Poppy?
I mean, I'd hope so, but I feel like I have fallen victim to trusting statistics too easily. Mm-hmm. Because I guess when political information is shared on social media, it's so concentrated. You don't really get the full scope of the situation. So they'll try to communicate it as clearly as possible, but a lot of that meaning is lost. So I feel like I have been misinformed a couple of times about different political issues through social media.
And I think for our generation, it's difficult to understand this, but Instagram and Snapchat, the news sources that, if it's on a serious issue, that's the worst place to get information on these sort of things, because they are so condensed, and there's this whole matter of followers and views and looking for attention, and often an influencer or whoever it is not the best place to go for this information. And it's even, despite the biases, news articles from actual news sites are the best place to go if you can't find the information from some primary source.
Right, and the motivation to share this information on social media is flawed, because the reason why people share these quick little slideshows of here's what's going on in Israel, here's what's going on in Pakistan, Black Lives Matter. It just serves as an accessory to their ego to show like, hey, I'm someone who cares about what's going on in the world, but doesn't look much further than that one particular slideshow.
And it's two different things, if I can add on to what you said. It's the fact that everyone has access to a platform where they can post something and where it can be viewed by people. And then you have the users there who maybe aren't really that interested in looking at these things in depth or doing a lot of reading on their own. So they're just looking for that quick, oversimplified information, or just picking one source or one or a few different accounts, and that's sufficient for them. I agree with you that would caution against going to any of those sites especially for politics.
Yeah, for sure. Quickly going back to, sorry, my neighbor has chickens. It's so annoying, but okay. Yeah, quickly going back to spreading political information on social media. I think within the context of our school, it is quite easy to assume that everybody our age views certain political issues the same way, because we're all in the same history class, we all have the same history teacher. It's quite easy to assume those things. But when I talk to people from outside of school, they tell me that before Black Lives Matter, I was not aware that as a white person you couldn't say the N-word because nobody talked about it at school. They weren't really encouraged to go seek out that information. So I think there can be positive effects of exposing people to certain political discourse through social media. However, like, you need to know when to stop, because then it just becomes a competition of who can be the most woke, who can be the most with it.
Yeah, that's true. There's nothing negative about exposing yourself to that sort of thing. And basically, because if you completely shut yourself out, then you become unaware and uninformed, which is maybe just as bad. But as you said, when it goes too far, as with the case with political fake news, because that is different from other sources of misinformation, because that sticks around a lot longer. And that becomes ingrained within just anything, whether it's like a misquote or an actual conspiracy theory, then that becomes factual in a way where no one ends up questioning it. And because a large amount of people remember that, and that's just in their minds now, there's nothing to be done about it. But yeah, I do think that's a good point that you made about the benefits that can come from that. So I do want to go over some ways that you can recognize misinformation. And the first is to be aware. Consider the intention of the piece or of the content you are reading. Often news sources are more biased than they may seem, and that's not because they're publishing fake news, but it's just because of what they're choosing to publish or what they're choosing not to say. It's very subtle, some of the things in the language, where you can see that it is maybe oriented towards this certain group or this certain agenda. But that does not necessarily discredit everything that they're saying. And it's the most damaging is to get only information on one side if this is a two-part or multiple part issue. If you can, look for an oppositional source that argues the opposite, just so that you're better informed. If you know a site that will do that. Obviously, not every issue is going to have clear website to go for where this will argue something different, but sometimes that is the case, especially with politics. And like what news sources also, no matter how big or how trustworthy, well known, they are also going to try to bait you or elicit some sort of emotional response, and as I said, cater to a certain group. And then again, part of that awareness is to maybe not take everything you read too seriously. And sometimes, even though it may seem ridiculous, people are fooled by satire, even though with most popular sites it's easy to spot, right? If you know the logo, right? If you know what the site is. But it can still confuse some people. And then, so second, evaluating the source further. Explore the website's credibility. Look up the author who wrote the piece, or look up the institution or company that published the information, and look at what else they've published. See what the credibility is based off of, well, what's the quality of their other articles? Are there evident biases in those as well? And that can help you get a better idea of how trustworthy whatever you're reading is. Oh yeah, also you should check the time to see when the article was published, as information can change and quickly. If you're looking at a study that's very old, it's probably not as valid as something more recent. But then again, there are instances when it's better to look at older articles when you're dealing with maybe political issues, if you want to see, I guess, more original versions of a situation. Although you don't get the benefit of hindsight, and over time you get more information. But sometimes the early things, right, the first time this interview was published, maybe there was something that articles that were subsequently written about it missed, or something that was twisted, as I said, as is sometimes the intention.
So our first question is, can we trust the fact checkers? Facebook and Twitter have increased fact checking after pressure from the U.S. government. Snopes is biased.
Yeah,
you're gonna have to explain to me.
Yeah, I like to talk. Yeah. So the question becomes, who is checking the fact checkers, and can fact checkers be biased? We were talking about satire earlier. This is one example that I was recently reading about. So some websites feel they need to label, like, or not discredit, but flag satire pages, right, for misinformation, which is okay, understandable if you have people that aren't aware that it's satire. Mm-hmm. But what certain sites like the Babylon Bee have found is that Snopes is biased in, or it's not necessarily Snopes, but I guess other fact checkers as well are biased in how they report on satire. Yes, as Babylon Bee reported, their comical articles that were more right-wing, even though Babylon Bee is generally more conservative, they found that the more conservative takes or satire articles were labeled as misinformation, while the other ones were left alone. And so that does raise a bit of a question on that, and why it's more important to protect one side, perhaps. But you do see the same thing on Twitter and Facebook. I really, maybe you'll disagree with me, but I don't think that these are equal and fair fact checkers that are working as part of these companies in this campaign against misinformation. Facebook gave $6.3 million in donations to the last election. That was 88% of their donations, and that was to Democrats, right? And Twitter also gives money exclusively to Democrat candidates, but yet there seems to be some backlash if you question the validity or trustworthiness of the fact checkers on these sites.
Right. I mean, clearly Facebook does, favor the Democratic Party, but tell me if I'm wrong in making this assumption. But taking Snopes, for example, the fact checker, wouldn't they be more likely to flag right-wing satire instead of left-wing satire, because right-wing satire is more likely to be talking about inciting violence? I don't want to say that the right wing is like a violent party in compared to the left, but I'm just thinking, for like satirical purposes, how would you make fun of the right-wing party? Probably talk about their guns and their obsession with the military.
Yeah, well, I'll reiterate my point, but what I mean by flagging right-wing satire, it means like satire geared more towards conservatives making fun of liberals. That's what and yeah, you're right that it does, it goes both ways, and that's the way that it should be. But when it comes to fact-checking sites who are showing preference or targeting one side more than the other, then that just raises a few. And obviously satire isn't all that important, as it's not the most misleading form of communication, but it still shows that even with sites that are meant to be neutral, there can be some bias.
Now, I'm just thinking about who is more likely to criticize the use of social media, that are more left wing or people that are more right wing. And first, I thought it would be more left wing people that would criticize the use of social media. But my opinion has changed. I think it's more right wing people because they are more used to their political beliefs coming under fire, especially on social media. So therefore, I guess they would be more defensive against that, like against Facebook and Twitter, rather than someone who identifies as a Democrat.
Yes, I do think these sites are, Twitter especially, is the majority are liberal, right? And so there's hostility towards the other groups. And so, as you said, yeah, they are more defensive, but that it's really ignorant if you can't recognize that, hey, this site, really is supporting my views as well, and to still maintain that stance of, oh well, it's a free platform. There's no restrictions of unfree speech, but hate speech, right? Which can get you banned or suspended, just happens to be whatever your agenda doesn't agree with.
I mean, yeah, look at Tumblr, for example. That really used to be like so unfiltered. There was not much censorship going on there. And there was no sense of organization, no sense of, it was, how do I articulate this? It was just all over the place, basically.
So there's no like responsible moderators, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think that that's a necessary role, is to have people looking through what you're posting and deeming it acceptable by whatever metric?
To some extent, yes. I think if it's about like public health or life or death, basically, I don't think there should be content that, like, say, fetishizes suicide or self-harm, that should be readily available for anyone to come across. I think that kind of stuff should be censored. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to go a little farther on what you said of like public health information, if we can skip ahead a little bit. I've seen this change alarmingly in the last, what has it been, a year now? Of the
Bit
pandemic.
over a year and a half almost.
A year and a half, wow. Where you see on any website that is, or any video or article that is talking about code, you'll see the little box. Even if it's on Twitter or on Instagram, you'll see the little, for official COVID information, go to the CDC website. Even if it's nothing about medical information, right? Even if it's just somebody saying like, oh, I can't wait for this to be over, or even if someone's just making, again, just a joke about it. And that's a little bit concerning, because I think maybe less so here in Europe, but in the States, there's been more of a struggle to control the narrative about the pandemic. And you can see this in individual leaders, right, who are trying to, either increase panic or calm people down. And that includes, banning videos that are questioning whether the lockdowns were necessary, or talking about uncertainty with vaccines. And while I understand the intention there to protect the public health of a population, I think that's very dangerous, because even if it's on quote unquote public independent platforms, that there's still government pressure. And so I think what we've seen a lot over the last year and a half is government all over the world just pressing further into platforms of speech and of news sites and publications to control the media, basically.
I think it comes like down to two things regarding the boxes of like for official like COVID-19 information head to this website. The first one being, yes, they want to communicate that this is an alarming situation and that people should remain careful for the sake of the general population. On the other hand, the algorithm isn't perfect, so anything regarding COVID-19 to them is about, keeping people safe. So that box will appear anywhere, even if it's just some kind of innocent discourse or just some satirical comedy.
So you think it's just a flaw with the algorithm?
I don't necessarily think it's like a flaw in the algorithm. I think it makes their job the job of regulating the algorithm a lot easier, but at the same time, it serves the purpose of, letting people know, like, hey, by the way, we don't just joke about this. This is real.
Oh, because I kind of saw it differently. I saw it a little more authoritarian, I suppose.
You could definitely interpret it that way, but I think for practical reasons.
But there are other ways where it goes beyond that. Another thing about the algorithm, because you also see this in posts where there's no text attached to it that mentions COVID, right?
Just like an image.
Yeah. So like if it's a screenshot of a tweet or whatever it is. So I think clearly there is ways to recognize advanced ways to be able to recognize this, and I think some companies have in a way shown their hand of what they can do for the sake of censorship. But going back to how this affects media outlets or shows, you know Steven Crowder, right?
No, who's that?
Oh, he does the show Louder with Crowder. It's like a right wing political commentary podcast or show, and he did he was going to do a live stream about, I don't remember if it was about just like the coronavirus or if it was about the vaccines, and it was blocked by YouTube, and he's had videos banned, and or suspensions because of this, and obviously he's going to take the side of being against mandatory vaccines and against lockdown. But is it right to remove these kinds of people from these platforms because you say, hey, this has broken what I think the way YouTube puts it, our community guidelines regarding COVID restrictions or COVID information?
Right. That I definitely think, is an issue. You should be allowed to voice your opinion, whether that like goes against whatever YouTube wants people to think. But I think that it still is important to remind people every time a joke is made, from like an algorithm standpoint, that, this is real and this isn't just some conspiracy. Because I think everybody would love to believe that this is a conspiracy. I would love to believe that COVID is a conspiracy, but I know that it's not. But the second that you, this is going to sound so bad, but the second you give the people the freedom to believe that it is a conspiracy, they're going to take that and they're going to run with it. And, obviously that's the opposite of what the government wants. But I do believe that it is important to remind people of, the scientific fact. However, that shouldn't be limiting other people's standpoint.
And so even on the level of whether it's YouTube channels or media companies or any other account that has a large fault, you think that they should not be censored if they give oppositional information or opinions?
Regarding COVID specifically, no, I think they should be allowed to speak about that.
And then in general?
In general, I mean, like, I think it's like hard to talk about this in a general sense because then you're also including like neo-Nazis and stuff and Holocaust deniers. So I think like, just like take it like a neo-Nazi, for example. If you like give those people like a public platform where they can speak freely and spread this misinformation about the Holocaust, you are endangering Jewish people's lives because that will allow for the community to become larger and eventually,
Yeah, and that's the same logic that's used
harm.
for COVID censorship, that endangering people.
Right, but like not in the same way, not in the same malicious sense. Yes, it's endangering people, but not with murderous intentions.
Yeah.
I think, for example, like allowing like neo-Nazis to, expand their groups, that would really expose the worst in society. And because if there is an intent to harm Jewish people, that's truly just because they want to kill them. But someone not wearing their mask, it's not about not harming the other people. It's genuinely because they just don't believe that it will harm other people.
Right.
It's more so about their own conspiracies rather than like malicious intent.
And I think whether you want to grant, whether it's the platforms themselves or the government, that that ability, it kind of depends on how you then see the role of government, right? Like, do you see them as the nurturing entity that needs to protect people from all these potentially dangerous things, or I think as on the other side, people just want to make decisions for themselves. You're going to inevitably be exposed to misinformation and lies and people that disagree with you. But I think that the issue there is that giving this power has led to censorship for the benefit of the state or for the benefit of a political agenda. So it's very hard to separate the two different concepts of separating this on behalf of protecting a group and using the same logic for a political strategy.
Yeah, I do think it's important to remain critical about your government and to feel like you have room to talk about that kind of stuff, because you can't assume that the government isn't hiding something from you, because how are they going to keep the general population in check without not exposing them to certain sensitive information? It's just not possible. So I think it's really dangerous to put complete trust in your government and to completely abandon your own agency as an individual.
Yeah, I agree.
And I'm not saying anarchy is the answer, but
Yeah. I mean, we don't really have the option now to have truly independent large. Oh, I mean, I guess we see more of them now, but we see that the ones that get the most attention or have political affiliations. And so what I'm hoping to see, and what I have started to see, is people moving more towards independent or alternative platforms or sources where the same censorship doesn't apply. But as you said, the negative effect is that sometimes these hate groups who are spreading what is undoubtedly misinformation and potentially harmful content, that's where they so even there, there's still going to be that struggle. But maybe perhaps we could at least remove the aspect of there being, hey, we're going to favor this one group and we're going to censor people that.
Yeah, I think like COVID-19 has definitely made me more critical of the government and any kind of institution like that, like the police. Before, I wouldn't really question it, and maybe this just comes down to like teenage rebellion, but it's just something that's really been on my mind lately, how we all just accept that this is the system that we operate in, that we have a government, they tell us what to do, and then we listen and we pay our taxes and so on and so forth. And how we've all just been conditioned to believe that this is the way it's supposed to be, because you have to keep society in check. But what if this is never the way that humans were supposed to operate? And I then again, I'm not an anarchist, but it's just something that's been on my mind.
And if when talking about misinformation and censorship, if that becomes, as it does, a matter of whether you're an anarchist, I think that's a bad sign, because that shows the extent to which the government's had to reach into outlets of speech. But was there any instance during, like, regarding COVID or something unrelated, if you can't think of anything, where you have been fooled by something that was misinformation?
Not really in the sense of fake news, but I guess just poor communication. For example, it was constantly changing, like around the winter time, like with how many people you were allowed to be out. Like, could you have someone in your home? How many direct contacts could you have? It was constantly changing, and I was trying to find out what are we allowed to do, and it was surprisingly hard to find well communicated information about these things. There wasn't really a website that kept a clear log of, this week you're allowed to do that, next week is this, 2 weeks ago it was that.
Despite the fact that you saw a lot of the links to the CDC website, but that did not usually cover what the local rules were. Yeah, I agree.
Right, it was specific to the Antwerp region. So I found myself having to go to social media to find out what am I allowed to do, and that shouldn't happen. Someone shouldn't have to resort to Instagram to find out whether or not the police has the right to arrest them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think on that level, the Flemish government really failed us.
And related to this, I think a lot also can be seen from the U.S. elections last November. Not only just if you want to go back and look at the different responses to the debates from the different news outlets, but then leading up to that, there was the Hunter Biden story, right? That was New York Times, I think, or New York Post. Sorry, New York Post. And because that was just before the election, in Facebook and Twitter, I don't know about the other sites, but those two blocked the article from being shared to try to suppress this story, and that clearly favors one candidate. And then the argument there was, I think they gave some BS response where they're like, oh, it was a mistake, we won't do it again. But then right after the January 6th riots, they kind of did the same suppression of information about election fraud. And then obviously there was this, actually maybe not obviously, I don't know if you know, but there was the purge of different Republicans, like, they kicked Trump off Twitter and off Facebook, and other people that were either related to that or had absolutely nothing to do with it, or in that way who were just Republican. And that was really alarming to me, to see these big tech companies buddy up towards this one party. And again, their excuse has been, we're an independent company and we have the right to choose what kind of information and what kind of users are on our platform, and they should go to alternative platforms. But
There's just something so dystopian about American politics. Like, viewing this as a European in Europe, it almost doesn't seem real. But back to the censorship on Twitter. For years, like since 2016, like there's just been like this open conversation, like, when is Trump going to get banned? When is Trump going to get banned? And most of the articles being published about Twitter were about Trump being on Twitter. So there was just like this huge commotion around his Twitter account. And I think Twitter almost saw this as kind of like, this story that's progressing. And then when the Capitol got stormed, that was like the natural conclusion. Like, yes, we hit them with like a banging ending.
that was the excuse.
Yeah, right. But I, to some extent, agree with Trump having been banned from Twitter at that time, because on his Twitter, even though he didn't say it directly, he was motivating people to go out and, continue to storm the Capitol. But then you also have to think, like, so those people just have no critical thoughts? Mm-hmm. Like, to some extent, you can think for yourself. But it's just the amount of power that Twitter account gave him. It was truly just dangerous to the institution of the government. So
it might be a little off topic, but I think it says a lot when you see that there was a very swift reaction to using the social media companies that helped to track down all the people that were involved, right, and to ban Trump right after that. But to see none of that happen when you had the riots around this time last year with Antifa and Black Lives Matter, like there was none of that same response, or none of that same censorship on the basis that it was inciting violence. But
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, even though I am more left wing, and I do align myself with Black Lives Matter, I still do believe that it should be the same treatment, regardless of motivation to riot.
Yeah, I agree.
It should be equal, because I could be on the other side of the spectrum. How would I think about my government if my opinions were being so heavily criticized and the other extreme wasn't? Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead. What point were you going to make?
Because a lot of like this discussion on fake news, that came from Trump, right? Because that was his catchphrase there, right? He kind of just said that a lot of things that were criticizing him unfairly were fake news, while constantly...
Or alternative facts.
Yeah, while constantly sharing clearly fake news websites, and think like photoshopping him on himself on Time magazine. But do you think that he was completely wrong with this? Like, even though, like, he clearly means in the context of
The
hey, this
Capitol
is
being
damn.
stormed.
No, just long before that, while he was
Oh,
still
okay.
running, and when he first became president, he talked about fake news a lot. I think he was right to some extent, because there was a lot of misinformation surrounding him and surrounding his campaign. But if you looked at like his performance during the presidential debates, that clearly doesn't go both ways, because he brought up obviously some stuff that like clearly was very likely and had happened, but then a lot of stuff that you would put under the category of conspiracy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like personally, I can't really take someone's criticism of fake news seriously if they use fake news to their own benefit. Like clearly this is not about misinformation. This is about stuff that puts you in a bad light. So that immediately takes away from their credibility. So anything that Trump has to say about fake news, I'm not going to pay attention to. But if anybody else has like valuable criticism of that specific information, then I would be happy to listen, but just not from Trump.
Because but even while like there may be again a valid argument there, the issue then is that it depends on kind of who's reporting on that, and he's not going to be taken seriously, and maybe you don't recognize the irony there when you think that it only goes one way, or that if you think that, hey, this news sources must be more trustworthy than this one, when there's a clear political difference.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying I would still listen to criticism of the left and fake news coming from like a right-wing conservative. I'd be happy to listen to what they have to say if they are proven to be a credible source, but I just don't consider Trump to be a credible source.
No.
It's for me, it's not about like the political spectrum, it's about the individual.
Can we agree that any politician is not a reliable source?
Yes.
Or was there anything else you wanted to add?
About like, should we censor misinformation? I believe that fake news could be seen in the context of postmodernism, the idea that we now live in a post-truth society. Many people believe that there's no such thing as objective truth, only social constructs, which means that we have no real basis in reality on which we can base our arguments. For example, like it's simply a scientific fact that gravity exists. That's just not a social construct. Science proves that. However, in this moment in history, we privilege interpretation over facts, individualism. But for example, the global warming discourse in the States, the fact that people without any kind of scientific degree have a platform to speak on global warming is proof that we value interpretation over facts because it's entertaining. And I'm not saying that these people shouldn't have room to speak, but why are we putting them to the same standard as scientists? That's just not right. But I think it's very easy to say like, oh, everything's a social construct. It's entertaining. I listen to someone talk about how everything is a social construct. Sure, go ahead and make your point. But I'm probably not going to agree with you. But I think this idea of everything is a social construct, it's just, the purpose of that is to make people seem like they have some kind of interesting and profound thing to say about the way our society operates, when really what they're saying stands for absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. That's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting comment on truth as a social construct, right? Because let's say theoretically that we were able to censor anything that could not be proven as true. Like say that when you publish something, that it works the same way as you would with a court case, right? If you're proven guilty of a crime, well then I think in that case, if we had to hold them to that standard where you had to have such an extent of certainty, then news outlets, shows, websites would not be able to exist at all. Even the most well-known and incredible ones. So yeah. I do think I do agree with that point, and I think the important takeaway from all of this should be also that it's not necessarily a bad thing if you encounter these biases within news or these misinformation, because if you compare and contrast it with other sources or other things, you can actually learn more about the origin of the source or for whatever purpose it serves. If it's a politician sharing something that's misleading, you can maybe ask why. And so it's not necessarily the case that you should ignore anything that you can define as misinformation, but just be wary and also be wary of fact-checking sites themselves.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, as you've mentioned here in the notes for this episode, you said censorship is more dangerous than misinformation. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I do think that censorship is more dangerous than misinformation, just because it almost always comes through, to some extent, state or a state actor, as I think we've discussed. Do you remember the book The Giver? Have you ever read that?
No, I haven't.
There was a quote by the author Lois Lowry that I think sums up well the point that I was trying to make. Just for some context, it's a dystopian novel that takes place in a society where the government controls every aspect of life, who your family is, what your role in society is, and you get suppressors that control your emotions. And so you have no freedom to love anyone or to do anything on your own accord. And the Giver, the point of that is because there's one person within this community that is responsible for having all the knowledge of the human race, while everyone else is completely ignorant. And the justification there is to protect the people from whether it's potential violence or misinformation or horrors. I think part of the moral debate within that book is whether it's the right for someone to do that and what the consequences of that are. And so from Laurie, the quote is, "Submitting to censorship is to enter the seductive world of the giver, the world where there are no bad words and no bad deeds, but it is also the world where choice has been taken away and reality distorted. And that is the most dangerous world of all." So do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, of course, then it becomes a discussion about, it's the government. They hurt us. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, then it's about, what do we censor? What can be censored? And then it's a conversation about your own moral compass. A final thing to add is if anybody would like to come on on the podcast and talk about something that you're passionate about or debate about something that you're passionate about, just shoot us an email or you can fill in the form